Our next reader is Jane Rosenberg LaForge. She has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize for Fiction and Poetry, the Best of the Net compilation for poetry, and the Story South Million Writers Award for Fiction. Her novel, The Hawkman, a fairy tale of the Great War, was named by Publishers Lunch Buzz Books as a book to watch in 2018. She is the author of a memoir and 6 volumes of poetry. Her chapbook, The Navigation of Loss, was one of 3 winners of the Red Ochre Lit Chapbook competition in 2012. You can find her website and her Facebook all on the links on Facebook and in the email. So thank you so much. Here's Jane.
Hi. I want to thank Catherine for having me and for all of you coming. It's a big deal for me, so thank you very much. So I'm going to read a little bit from the novel, and basically at this point in the novel, a homeless man has wandered into town, and a woman has taken him in, and I'll leave it at that. When the weather became more consistent, if not thoroughly agreeable, Miss Williams took to planting the garden she had spoken of. Alone she started, as Sheehan refused her almost daily entreaties. "Good morning," she'd say before breakfast. "Wouldn't you like to join me?" But she was gone before he could answer, out the door and around the side of the cottage, in a long jacket she wore to protect her clothes. She worked on several small plots, and he stood by a small window in the main room where she might not notice him. She turned over dirt, planted cuttings, chrysanthemums. They were best planted in the autumn, but, as she explained later, the bitter scent of those flowers would keep insects away. She was a small woman, and the work made her smaller still. She was often on her knees, as though the soil demanded an exacting kind of attention. He stood at that window and stepped back when he thought she might have caught a glimpse of his looking. He moved in closer as he thought he saw her struggling with weeds or the squirrels that threatened her work. She had to encase the pumpkins in wires she had found from a chicken coop, a favorite topic of hers on those evenings when she took her meal with him. She wondered if the plants could sense being caged within, or whether they would feel doubly trapped as the pattern of the light that fell upon them would be like a net. Would the stems crane themselves into unhealthy postures and the pumpkins come out lopsided or with some other sort of defect? In the end, she concluded that it couldn't be helped. It was a net or certain death at the appetites of the squirrels, which were charming but voracious. "Would you take some air?" she'd sometimes ask, and he did not shake his head no, but he was not leaving the cottage. He could watch the garden more directly after breakfast, once she left for the college and would not be back until long after the sunset. He watched the sun rise farther still, over the tree line before it poured itself into the garden. He saw how the soft, almost marshy soil gathered itself together as though it was a soldier searching out his gear after a spill in the mud. He resolved to go outside to assist her once he could be assured that the light would not deceive him, once he was confident the light would not sear into his eyes, only to disappear in an instant, once the sounds the air must have made against grass, stems, and branches were secured, and he might actually hear them. Above the clanging and hum in his ears, he could listen for bees and dragonflies. She was a diligent gardener. She worked through the sun and through the showers. She left the watering can out in the soft rain to collect the rainwater. If she found ladybugs in one part of the garden, she'd move them to another to dispose of the ravaging insects chewing up leaves and flowers. She planted more cuttings, blooming plants, and on the weekend sat before her work as if to admire it. "Won't you take a look?" she asked, with just a twinge of pride in her voice, but he could see just as well from the window. The cottage was dark one morning, and there was no light outside, but a storm, the kind that brought rats out in the trenches. She said nothing as she plunged outside, wearing her usual gear, though her hair was loose, not piled into a hat. She ran to the shed to find a shovel and dashed back. She started digging around a vegetable bed. He knew how the dirt would be heavy, uncooperative, slipping out of the mouth of the shovel just as she raised it clear off the ground. The sound of the shovel landing in the mud as if it were a cut of meat. She made little progress, gave up on one bed and moved to another. He saw what she hoped to accomplish, a trench or trenches to capture the rain and keep it from flooding. The rain saturated her jacket and hat, a pelting rain that makes a froth of the dirt. He was out of the cottage and taking the shovel from her hands. His palms burned where his calluses rose, but that no longer mattered. He worked through his runny eyes and nose, the risky footing, and the shiver at the small of his back. The rain, the dirt, Miss Williams pacing around him or running ahead to sort out the next turn of the trench she wanted, he could smell and feel nothing. It was such easy dirt. The occasional root or stone that emerged was not much to wrestle. He could easily grab at it with his hands and toss it away. During the war in France, one might shovel on the line and find them missing, or their limbs. Joints specifically, elbows, knees, the cut of the waist, material that allowed the body to bend and therefore crouch and hide. The shelling was hardest on these connections. The bombs shattered them or made them to fly off and sometimes buried them in the process. Digging into the mud freed them, along with swatches of uniforms, loose ordnance, rations and shaving kits, letters, locks of hair from lovers and children. If one dug in an abandoned part of the trench, the mass could come out as bricks, the human refuge like mixing material, the straw that grips onto sediment. In the first reprisal camp he was sent to as a prisoner of war at Sedan, one only dug latrines, those reminders of human frailty. But digging latrines was not particularly daunting, only backbreaking and, if done wrong, predictably foul. They were merely holes besides other holes that were used up, filled in. The lime did not smell, but it burned the skin. By the time he was made to dig latrines, the lime could only make a minor contribution to the wreckage of his hands. The lime added scales to the other offenses. Sometime during the autumn at Sedan, he collected a gash to his middle finger. He noticed the cut, which began in the finger pad and plummeted past the first joint after coming off a commando, harvesting wheat without gloves. It did not necessarily hurt, but that might have been the time of day after his bit of bread and tea, when he was so tired he was drained of all sensation. He licked it clean as well as he could, and on the following days he nursed it with the hot water that was meant for his tea, and rags he made from his clothes. In a few days' time, his fingernail had turned black, as though a hole had been gouged all the way through. Then the finger swelled up as if it were a lip, or an eye, or any other reasonable part of the body accustomed to bulging after injury. His other fingers on that hand suffered through the extra burden he put on them to rest the injured finger, although what was suffering for them at this point? His hands were caked over in abuse, their skin like a prison. It cracked and bled in the colder months, as though it meant to restore itself, molt or shed, but failed in the attempt. When he dared to look at his hands, he saw not his own appendages, but the unguarded nails and knuckles of a heedless beast. Still human, though he no longer knew what human was. Then the swelling turned blue, a much more virulent shade than any bruise of his experience, and he thought he saw the deathly cast sweeping through his palm. At night, as he lay in his bunk, he held his hands in front of him and tried to imagine how he would cope should he lose the finger. He knew that he would still be able to play his piano. There were plenty of fellows playing with the fingertips sheared off, even some who'd lost a finger down past the knuckle. He'd seen them in pubs, playing tinny machines for tips with hardly a mark in their repertoire. The question was, what would the missing finger do to his playing? How would his fingers traverse the keyboard without that one step or curl? Would phantom notes sound out like phantom pain? Would he have to have the same finger removed on the opposite hand to keep his sense of equilibrium? Would he no longer be able to hear the keys that middle finger once graced? Would those notes refuse a different action, from a different kind of hand? As he pondered all this at night, just before lights out in the prison camp barracks, the unaffected fingers of the left hand seemed to move, space out from one another, as if the palm were stretching to accommodate a new arrangement. He would have just 4 digits, like a cloven-hoofed animal or a bird and its talons. His hands then rushed to his face as if to blot out the image, but he could not escape it. It followed him even as he kept the hand hidden through meals, marches, work on the fields. A guard must have decided to take pity on him, or perhaps there was no pity involved. the efficiency of the unit, the cost of losing another prisoner. Somehow the man was inspired to give Sheehan some turpentine and proper bandages. The turpentine turned the finger yellow, but tamped down the swelling. Another limb salvaged, but for the Germans' purposes. "You've done enough," she said. Her voice through the rain was real and in the present. They were in her garden. She was the woman who had taken him in, and she had one hand atop his on the shovel and the other beneath his left hand, its middle finger white from the rain, the rest pink from exertion, the calluses on the palm facing upward as if they were eyes blinded. Thank you.